taxi cab.
What do you mean a taxi cab? I thought we were flying.
Precisely.
All right, Doc, what's going on, huh? Where are we? When are we?
We're descending toward Hill Valley, California at 4:29 p.m. on Wednesday, October 21st, 2015.
2015? You mean we're in the future?
Future, Marty? What do you mean? How can we be in the future?
Jennifer, I don't know how to tell you this, but you're in a time machine.
And this is the year 2015?
October 21st, 2015.
God, so like you weren't kidding. Marty, we can actually see it.
Imagine that. October 21st, 2015. I might also note that if you pull out your program and turn to the very back 2 pages, a little error was made, something fortuitous perhaps, because rather than it saying Thursday, October 22nd, 2015, it actually says Thursday, October 21st, 2015. So note that the last 2 pages of your program actually do refer to tomorrow.
Well, that just seems like wish fulfillment.
Why? Don't go anywhere! You're next!
Speaking of criminals, it's nice to...
All right. Let's hope that ends. Well, okay, obviously it's October 21st, 2015, and for those fans of the Back to the Future series, you'll note that the Cubs... I know, I get it. One game at a time, Cub fans. Hoverboards, yeah, we may have to wait a while longer for hoverboards, and I'm sorry, Cubs fans, but if we have hoverboards before a World Series victory, it's going to be a long wait. I also note that in the second movie, by 2015, it noted that attorneys had been outlawed. So, I want you to all raise your hand if you were at our last symposium in 2011. Raise your hand. And keep your hand up if you were also at our 2006 symposium in DC. Keep it up. And if you were in our 04 symposium in DC, 02 symposium in DC, 2000 symposium in DC, yeah, stand up now. Those, please stand up. Those who had your hands up the whole time. Those are our cadre groupies. And we love you. We'll see you in 2 years. I know you'll be there. As I'd mentioned yesterday, Cadre started convening folks from around the country back in 2000 to gather together, learn from each other, explore possibilities, and think more deeply about this critical work we're engaged in. The work of resolving disputes in ways that are not damaging, but are creative, not destructive, but productive. How do we focus our mutual efforts on building strong partnerships between parents and educators, strong partnerships across the entire team of professionals and family members? How do we inspire our shared vision of helping children and youth with disabilities lead not only the most meaningful lives imaginable, but living the most ordinary days possible? Beginning in 2000, we've been visited upon by various luminaries in the field of dispute resolution, such as Baruch Bush, Edie Prim, Dudley Weeks, Carrie Menkel-Meadow, Peter Adler, Bernie Mayer, Michelle LeBaron, pioneers all in helping to further a noble cause that has few equals, that of the peaceful resolution of disputes, where people most affected by the dilemma are offered an opportunity to partner together and to be given a voice. Each of these pioneers leaving so much more than an impression on us and on others John Paul Lederach urging us to find the moral imagination to create authentic community. Mary Parker Follett visited, voiced by our friend Albie Davis. And Mary encouraged us to embrace conflict as opportunity, suggesting that the sound of a violin is made through friction. All polishing is done through friction. And today, we are incredibly privileged to have yet another luminary with us. Two, really. As Albie brought us Mary, today, Tom is bringing us Abraham Lincoln. Now, Tom has many things to his credit: books, articles, lectures, awards. What I imagine you don't know is that Tom is listed in IMDb. Did you know that? You didn't know that, did you? What is IMDb? The Internet Movie Database. The world's most popular and authoritative source for movie, TV, and celebrity content. That's right. You are listed in there as a cast member of Desmond Tutu, Peacemaker, along with two other cast members, one John Allen and one Desmond Tutu. Now, I don't mean to make light of this beautiful and moving documentary, which is easily found on YouTube, and I highly recommend it. Highly recommend you watch it when you get a chance. And I mention it to illustrate the breadth of his experiences and illuminate the depth of his influences. While a noted authority in the practice of arbitration, not exactly your most heartfelt approach to resolving conflicts, Tom has enormous compassion. I know this because I've had the chance to really get to know him and have a great conversation with him. So I know that Tom has been blessed with both an enormous heart and a keen intellect. He operates both from here and from here. So, it is our lasting good fortune to have Tom here today to take us back to the future and help us understand how lessons from the past can help forge a more desirable, a more beautiful landscape for our shared future together. Please join me in welcoming Tom Stipanowitch. Another moment of technical.
Just ignore the man behind the curtain. How's that? Okay, wonderful. I have to say that was an incredible introduction, and there's no way I can live up to it. All I'll say is, reminds me of a story my dad used to tell about a man who was introduced as someone who made $10 million in the stock market, investing in natural gas. And he said, I'm really moved by the introduction that I was given, but I do have to offer some qualifications. He said, first of all, it wasn't natural gas, it was investment in oil. And it wasn't $10 million, it was $20 million. And it wasn't a gain, it was a loss. So I feel a little bit like that. I have to tell you that coming back here, I think this is all about deja vu today. I was here once before. It was in early 1984. I was a young attorney, and as I recall, I don't even remember why I was here. Somehow that doesn't seem the point anymore. But I believe that at the time, I was conducting a deposition out here with some witness in Eugene, Oregon. And I stayed at the Valley River Inn. And I remember the front of the inn. That's one thing I remember. I remember having a glass of Oregon wine. And I've really had a special place in my heart for Oregon vineyards since then, even though I live in California now. The other thing was that I had a chance to walk along the river. And I remembered all of those things very vividly. Now, back then, I don't think there were all these other buildings, stores and shops and restaurants around here. but I do remember it. And in many ways, it feels like coming home. My wife, as you'll hear in a minute, is from the South. And she has family all over the South. And we once heard a lecture by, her father was a Presbyterian minister, and another minister was delivering a lecture talking about the gift of hospitality. And he said it just that way, the gift of hospitality, which is a particularly Southern gift, I think, but other people have the gift of hospitality too. And as I was saying this morning, I think that Phil Moses is a genius when it comes to, as Marshall said, an outlier when it comes to hospitality. And he made me feel very welcome from our first conversation together. And I've got to tell you that everybody I have met here has made me feel very welcome and frankly part of a community, even though I have not had the privilege of being at a cadre meeting before. I really feel at home here. And I also have to say that I'm privileged and humbled to be with people who are doing such important work. I think it's extraordinary. You are among the highest and best practitioners of what we learn as a field. Again, I'm just proud to be among you. Well, today we're... Go back one slide. Okay, go back one slide. Oh, yes, here it is. This is October 21st, 2015.
I just have to note, I'm sorry. If you'll note on the bottom, this is the flux capacitor. If you'll notice the bottom, October 28, 2011, 5 p.m., that is when we departed our last symposium 4 years ago. Oh. Our present time is pretty much exactly October 21st, 2015 at 8:45 a.m. And our destination time is March 4th, 1861, the day of Abraham Lincoln's inauguration.
Okay. Wow. Okay. I don't know why I'm here, but I guess it was predestined. That's all I can say. Okay. So I guess we already know how this is going to turn out, right? Anyway, I've never been more excited about speaking about anything, quite frankly, or to any audience, and I'm very serious when I say that. I think we'll have a good time today together. I want to share with you what I've learned about this great man. And I have to say that at this present point in our nation's political and civil discourse, I wish, frankly, we had someone of the stature of Lincoln to be a part of it and to give us leadership. There is all too little of this today. Enough of that. But that's a postscript that must be added to a talk about conflict resolution and conflict management. Now, as a child, I grew up in the shadow of this man. I was just talking to Kelly from Springfield, who knows that when you live in Illinois as a child, it's all Lincoln all the time. And of course, I was particularly obsessed as a young boy with Lincoln. Here I am. That's not actually me. I looked something like that, but I wasn't that cute. So anyway, here I am, working diligently on some report about Abraham Lincoln prior to going to New Salem or Springfield on yet another annual pilgrimage. My brother and I were obsessed with Lincoln. My younger brother, in fact, had a thing about presidents. He knew everything about presidents, their last words, their favorite drink, whether or not it was alcoholic or not. This is at 6 years old. But, he used to drive me crazy because he said, Tom, I just realized something. He said, our 16th president is not Abraham Lincoln. He had just learned to read. He said, it's Abraham Lincoln. So for a long time, we talked about Abraham Lincoln. Anyway, so like many school children, I was really just very focused on Lincoln. In Illinois, again, it's unavoidable. But we had a particular emphasis on Abraham Lincoln growing up and still do. When I was in architecture school, I happened to pick up Carl Sandburg's Lincoln Trilogy, which is a very moving document. Historians sometimes challenge the accuracy of some of his statements, but to me, it really spoke to me on this level and was one of the reasons why I ended up going back to law school. I had the image of Lincoln in front of me. Now, I don't want you to think I'm just overly obsessive about Lincoln, but as you know, Abraham Lincoln married Mary Todd. Where was Mary Todd from? Lexington, Kentucky, which then was sort of, an island of intellectual capital and education and culture west of the Alleghenies. So it was sort of viewed as a bastion of the East out on the frontier, which is what Springfield was back in the 1830s and 40s. Mary Todd came up there to stay with her sister and married Lincoln. So he marries a Lexington girl. Well, I did the same thing. This is my wife, Sky. My wife, Sky's a wonderful woman. I have to say that I believe our marriage has probably had entailed less friction than what we read about sometimes in the Lincoln family. I will say, however, my wife said when we get back home that she wants to go to the theater on Saturday night, and I'm always a little bit leery about that. So anyway, I don't know how many of you are aware of it. How many of you have ever read a book about Abraham Lincoln? Let me see your hands. Yeah, and I'll bet a lot of you read Team of Rivals, didn't you? That's probably the most popular book of the last quarter century about Abraham Lincoln, but books come out every week about Lincoln. I have about 250 of them in my library, but it's impossible to keep track. So I decided I would write another book about Lincoln, and that's what I'm going to be working on my sabbatical. Now, I've written an article and done a lot of research primarily on his law practice, and that's going to be my primary emphasis today. And I'll tell you in a minute why I began looking at that. Lincoln said some amazing things. If Lincoln were up here today, he would fit right in, as you will see. And I'm not just saying this. Everybody has a tendency to kind of connect with Lincoln or identify with Lincoln and say, well, Lincoln and I share things. But this is a situation where we really do share certain things with Lincoln, and he stands as a model and a reinforcement and a resonance with the things that we do today. So someday I hope to add my book to this pile, which you can find in a museum in Washington, D.C. I want to mention one other thing, though, before I jump into the basic lessons today. How many of you have seen this picture? It's a beautiful picture, isn't it? This is Lincoln with Tad. This is his fourth son. Now, many of you may be familiar with the character of Tad. You know that Lincoln and Tad had a very close relationship. Robert was away at college. The other two sons had died. Willie, fairly recently in 1862. So Tad is the only son at home. He's been described in many interesting ways. Tad's been described as sensitive, exasperating, loving, highly emotional. His behavior was very unpredictable, and he was often very difficult to deal with. Now, Lincoln was very tender with his son, and just about as indulgent as a father could be. And there are many stories about that. But here's what I wonder if you know. It's very relevant to what we're doing here today. There's also evidence in the record that Tad Lincoln had severe learning disabilities and may not actually have learned to read until after Lincoln died. He may also have had great difficulties in articulation and language development, perhaps as the result of a cleft of the soft and/or hard palate. Now, if he'd lived today, Tad's apparent complex disorders could have been addressed straightforwardly by plastic surgery, by speech pathologists, perhaps by psychologists, etc. But 150 years ago, there was little that could be done to help even the son of the President of the United States. Tad's life was hard. He died in 1871, 6 years after Lincoln was assassinated. Well, let's get back to our main topic. Lincoln's legal career occurred in the 8th Judicial Circuit in central Illinois, from the 1830s, actually up until the early 1860s when he was president. It embraced the full spectrum of practice in courthouses such as these. And Lincoln, of course, rode the circuit. His regional practice saw a tremendous evolution from the barest frontier to a settled Burschen economy. He handled everything from actions to get back a pig to capital cases, both as defense counsel and as a prosecutor, and major railroad litigation. Now, one of his most famous cases, and I'm just reading a book about this, is Heard versus Rock Island Bridge Company. This is often known as the F.E. Afton case. And it was a very prominent case of the time because it pitted the riverine interests, the steamboat companies, and the city of St. Louis, really, against the city of Chicago and the railroad interests. And so it was very, very important information, a very, very important case of the time. Lincoln appeared on behalf of the railroad, as he sometimes did. Now, Lincoln appeared on both sides of cases involving the railroad, as we'll see. But in some months before he was nominated for president, he apparently turned down an opportunity to become general counsel of the New York Central Railroad, one of the nation's leading corporations. Today we're going to focus on a number of principles that animated Lincoln's law practice, gleaned from his own files. We'll also draw occasional parallels and supplementary episodes from the same time, when as chief of state, he led his country through its ultimate and defining crisis. Lesson 1, use litigation as a last resort. Be frank with your client about its cost and risk. Avoid irrational optimism. Now, here's the reason that I'm here today talking to you. In 1850, Lincoln prepared and apparently delivered a lecture to other lawyers. And here's what he said. Discourage litigation. Tell your or persuade your neighbors to compromise whenever you can. Point out to them how the nominal winner is often a real loser in fees, expenses, and waste of time. As a peacemaker, the lawyer has the superior opportunity of being a good man. Of course, they were all men back then. There will still be business enough. And when I read that, I couldn't believe it. That was 1850. Now, keep in mind that this is someone who was an inveterate trial lawyer. And he was also an appellate lawyer par excellence. He was terrific. He made his living as a litigator. But these were words he made and, as I discovered, he lived by. This is William Herndon, who many of you have heard of. Herndon was an important and remains a very important source of our information about Lincoln. He said Lincoln was even better in a set-piece battle before appellate judges than in trial, as good as he was in trial. But Lincoln always placed an emphasis, as we will see, on preparation and well-developed logic. And yet, time and again, Lincoln discouraged clients from pursuing litigation or strongly cautioned them about costs and risk. Look at this letter, which I have reproduced, so hopefully you can read it. But I'm going to share with you the language. He said, "Yours of February 28, 1859 is received. I do not think there is the least use of doing any more with the lawsuit. I not only do not think you are sure to gain it, but I do think you are sure to lose it. Therefore, the sooner it ends, the better." Okay? Pretty straightforward, don't you think? Now, Herndon and other friends have over and over again remarked on Lincoln's propensity for seeking a settlement in lieu of court. One of his former law clerks said, I remember him telling would-be clients again and again, you have no case, you better settle. Now, there's several reasons for this, I think, if you know Lincoln. One is he had great faith in the power of reason and logic, and himself exhibited great precision of mind, as we'll see, but probably discerned the limitations of legal process. First of all, there were crowded circuit court dockets. In most places, the court would only show up every 6 months or so for a few days. There are the difficulties of procuring evidence and witnesses on the frontier, unpredictable tribunals and juries, and finally, the difficulty of actually executing on a debt in the face of a determined recalcitrant debtor. Lincoln's files included this case. Now, this is Canaan versus Kenny. I don't know how many of you have read Bleak House, Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, which went on forever, for generations. This is Lincoln's Jarndyce versus Jarndyce. This case ran from until 1863, actually. Now, this involved a nuncupative will. This took 4 years. There's another case that actually ran for an extraordinary length of time from 1853 until 1863. And it wasn't actually resolved until Lincoln was in the middle of the Civil War, and he received a message from Illinois that it had finally gotten resolved. They referred to it as the Great McDaniel case. Then there's this one, Oldham versus Hemingway. Now, Lincoln empathized. Lincoln's very noted for his empathy, but I have to tell you that Lincoln's personal experiences resonated with those of many of his clients. He was aware very much of the personal and reputational cost of being sued. He experienced extreme indignation and anguish when two surviving partners of his father-in-law's business, Oldham and Hemingway, brought a cause of action against him for withholding monies due to the partnership that he'd allegedly collected. In essence, they were accusing him of fraud. Now, although the cause of action was ultimately deemed to be meritless, the bitter sting of this experience lingered long afterward. Lincoln lived in a society, you have to understand, which depended less on banks than on the personal credit of individuals, evidenced by promissory notes. Individuals were accustomed, as Lincoln was, to functioning both as creditors and debtors. Now, in times of economic downturn, which were somewhat frequent back then, many a promissory note would remain unpaid by its due date. For a variety of reasons, the most rational solution was for a creditor to make appropriate accommodations rather than seek immediate foreclosure. And Lincoln, over and over again, spoke in favor of such adjustments. There was a time earlier in his life when the store that he co-owned ran into serious debt. It took him years to pay it off. He called it his personal national debt. So he's very much aware of the problems of debtors. Here's another one. This is a letter to a Louisville wholesaler who'd retained him to collect debts from Central Illinois merchants. He said, we've been receiving promises from time to time of payment. Payment has yet to be made, and unless payment is soon made, we shall commence suits. Though this course we shall regret, for they are honest and reasonable men, but they are hard-pressed. Now, not surprisingly, Lincoln reserved his greatest contempt for those who would stir up litigation. This is also from his law lecture. He said, "A worse man can scarcely be found than one who does this. Who can be more nearly a fiend than he who habitually overhauls the register of deeds in search of defects in titles, whereon to stir up strife and put money in his pocket? A moral tone ought to be infused into the profession which should drive such men out of it." By the way, if you look back at Lincoln's early life, his family moved from Kentucky, where he was born, to Indiana and then to Illinois. But there's evidence that a primary reason for those moves had to do with suits relating to the property on which they were attempting to live. And particularly in Kentucky, titles and disputes over land were a constant battle. And this is something that I think remained in Lincoln's mind for a long time. Lesson 2, try to be objective in assessing your client's case. Avoid irrational optimism. Now, modern research has demonstrated that when we're locked in conflict, reality is filtered through our own cognitive processing. We can be less objective about our conflict and surrounding circumstances, creating various kinds of negotiating traps or opportunities. For example, as lawyers, many of us may have a tendency to be overly optimistic about our chances in court, to overvalue our case. Like the citizens of Lake Wobegon, we tend to believe that all our children are above average. There's the commitment effect. We take a position, we feel pressure to behave consistently with that, or when we receive information, we pay more attention to the information that supports our case. Or reactive devaluation. If a proposal comes from an opposing party, it's automatically suspect or devalued. Now, according to Herndon and others, Lincoln's perceptions were slow, cold, and exact. They said he saw everything through a perfect mental lens. He was not impulsive, fanciful, or imaginative, but calm and precise. In short, not a man who was likely to fall prey to false hopes or inflated expectations. Now, there's another story about a developer who came to Lincoln, a Chicago real estate speculator. He saw a golden opportunity to buy state land at wetland prices. He perceived a loophole in state statutes that would allow him to buy property from the state at a little over $1 an acre, which was a steal, even back in 1856. He knew that Lincoln was an expert on property law, came down from Chicago to talk to him. Lincoln said, "I'll have an answer for you in a few days." Well, he returned to Springfield, went into Lincoln's office, and just as he walked in the door, Lincoln looked up and said, "You can't do it." Chrisman was stunned. He said, "You know, I thought this was an opportunity for Lincoln at least to take some time and earn a flat fee, but he only charged me $5 for his efforts." Lesson 3, be clear about your client's interests and focus your energies accordingly. Now, I have to tell you, this is one of the most fascinating aspects of Lincoln's practice to me. He was really adept at identifying underlying interests, key priorities, the needs, feelings, drives, and motivations that lie beneath the surface of human interaction and that animate most legal struggles. A classic illustration involved causes of action for slander. Now, an action for slander back on the Illinois frontier in the 1840s or 1850s usually took a couple of different forms. If the plaintiff was a man, the plaintiff had usually been accused of economic fraud or shady business dealings. With women, the emphasis tended to be on another kind of morality, on alleged fornication, whatever. So, you know, a so-called loose woman. Well, this was a situation where Lincoln and his legal community understood that in these situations, the subject could be stigmatized and that no economic satisfaction that they might get out of a court was as important as the ultimate vindication, the clearing of their name. Only the latter would have a chance of permitting a person to once again effectively navigate in their social environment, restore damaged relationships, and heal emotional wounds. Therefore, we have this case, Moran versus Baddeley. This is an example of a situation where the lawyers, Lincoln and the other lawyer, agreed to a consent judgment. Now, the agreed judgment, which he obtained on behalf of a woman who had been accused of immoral conduct and sued for slander, was for the full amount that had been claimed. However, little or no money ever changed hands. Indeed, it was the formal and public acknowledgement, it was the symbolism of the act that was the important thing. And it's probable, it has been said, that Lincoln's skill as a mediator probably came into play in cases like this. Give your priority immediate attention. Like Ben Franklin, Lincoln said, get it done, and get it done early. He said, the leading rule for a lawyer, as for a man of every other calling, is diligence. Leave nothing for tomorrow which can be done today. And he goes on at some length to talk about that. Now, Lincoln, by his own lights, was not a quick study, but he was capable of intense concentration on the subject at hand. Lincoln later brought the same skills and commitment to his role as commander-in-chief. But he did not micromanage. However, he did educate himself. To the extent important as a president on military strategy and tactics, ordnance, etc. Focus on the crux of the case and earn points for conceding non-essential elements. Now, this is something that, as I learned about Lincoln's career and what he actually did, I was particularly impressed by. It resonates with me as someone who has spent a lot of time not only as an advocate, but as someone who adjudicates and sees a lot of advocates. Lincoln, as we said, it was slow and methodical in analyzing a case and honing strategies. But his care in preparation would allow him to reduce a matter to its essentials. Lincoln was a logician, no question about it. The story is that on the circuit, as he used to travel around with his colleagues, he would lie there in the bed, probably sharing it with at least one other person, and his long bare feet would be sticking out beyond the end of the bed. He'd have a candle at his side, and he'd be reading Euclid, geometry, at 2 in the morning. So this is Lincoln. But he systematically developed chains of reasons that would support his case or defeat his opponents. He was rigorous in testing the legal viability and factual grounding of pleas. But he was able to isolate that which was important from that which was not. And that's a very effective tactic. I have found that many advocates who feel they have to win every battle, however small, on whatever level, not only make the whole dispute resolution process less efficient and sometimes less effective, but they also create a bad impression. Lincoln was very effective at doing the opposite. Listen to this quote from Leonard Swett, someone who appeared both with him and against him on many occasions in court. He said, as Lincoln entered the trial where most lawyers object, Lincoln would say he reckoned it would be fair to let this in or that, and sometimes when his adversary could not quite prove what Lincoln knew to be the truth, Lincoln would say he reckoned that it would be fair to admit the truth to be so-and-so. When he did object to the court, after he heard his objection answered, he would say, well, I reckon I must be wrong. Now, from the time he had practiced this through the case, if his adversary wasn't careful, he would wake up a few minutes later, finding that he had feared the Greeks too late and woke up to find himself beat. He was wise as a serpent in the trial of a cause. He said, I've got too many scars from his blows to certify that he was harmless as a dove. When the whole thing was unraveled, the adversary begins to see that what Lincoln was so blandly giving away was simply what he couldn't get and keep. By giving away 6 points and carrying the 7th, he carried his case, and the whole case hanging on the 7th, he traded away everything which would give him the least aid in carrying that. Any man who took Lincoln for a simple-minded man would very soon wake up with his back in a ditch. Begin negotiating cooperatively and encourage the reliance of others by behaving in a logical and predictable way. Look for trade-offs. Now, when we talk about Lincoln, we have to remember that to some extent Lincoln was representative, although perhaps to a greatly enhanced degree, of certain tendencies in his community. In the legal community in which Lincoln practiced, a cooperative approach to negotiating legal disputes was facilitated by the bonds of familiarity. The uncertainties of negotiation were reduced because many of the lawyers Lincoln negotiated with were well known to them. You heard me mention that they would travel around on the circuit together. They would spend the night together in hotels for weeks or months. So this was a very close-knit network of sharing bonds. Lincoln regularly would serve alongside an attorney and the next day appear against him in another case. In 1 or 2 cases, from what I can tell from my research, he even ended up appearing on both sides of a particular extended litigation at different times. I don't know what that's all about. But relational connections were very important. They reinforced the likelihood of a collaborative solution. And Lincoln and his peers would sometimes avoid extreme positional bargaining and the posturing that goes with it. In some cases, personal familiarity with both parties encouraged Lincoln to play the role of a mediator. Listen to what he says in this letter to a client. He said, I understand Mr. Hickox will go for the purpose of meeting you to settle the difficulty about the wheat. I sincerely hope you will settle it. I think you can if you will, for I have always found Mr. Hickok a fair man in his dealings. If you settle, I will charge nothing for what I have done and thank you to boot. By settling, you will most likely get your money sooner and with much less time and trouble. Now, throughout his life, Lincoln adhered to that old maxim, a drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall. Lincoln understood the power of a meaningful trade-off, the quid pro quo, in achieving a bargain. As a youthful member of the Illinois legislature, Lincoln was adept at log rolling, working with other legislatures to, in essence, have a trade. You help me on my legislation, which you don't care a lot about one way or the other, and I'll do the same for you. Lincoln's political acumen was such that he actually was very instrumental in getting the state capital of Frontier, Illinois, moved from southern Illinois, Vandalia, to Springfield. The same skills were of great value in the negotiation of legal disputes, where, to use Lincoln's metaphor, one used in this letter, a stitch in time may save 9. Now, we do have to be realistic about this. Lincoln was an inveterate politician. He was always a politician. And frankly, his legal career, as important as it was, has to be seen alongside his role in politics, which was constant. Lincoln probably must have seen just about everybody in that courtroom, every client, every adversary, as a potential voter. He was rigorously even-handed in his treatment of parties in council, regardless of their political affiliation. Now, of course, as we have alluded, if cooperative negotiation failed to produce a positive response, Lincoln could turn right around and, as a competitive bargainer, would be in a position to draw upon his formidable trial advocacy skills, and at the same time, as we've seen, his innate objectivity would make him less susceptible to an opponent's efforts to manipulate or mislead him. Lesson 7, seek creative ways of bridging the gap to an agreement that achieves a client's key goals and priorities in a simple, straightforward manner. Now, we talked about the creative use of consent judgments in slander cases. That's only one example of Lincoln's penchant for inventive approaches. Lincoln and other lawyers made resort to, and here's that word, binding arbitration. Why was there so much private binding arbitration, or not even non-binding arbitration, on the frontier? Well, because most of the year there was no court around to appeal to. And arbitration was used quite extensively, and Lincoln did use it. Sometimes the parties employed arbitration without agreeing to be bound by the result. And in such cases, either party could refuse to abide by the award. And that's what we see going on here in Hall versus Perkins, a case involving Lincoln. Now, in addition to serving as an advocate in arbitration, Lincoln had experience as an arbitrator. Interestingly, the one case that I'm familiar with really didn't involve his skill as a lawyer as much as it did his skill as a surveyor. And in fact, if you look at the final award, it's a boundary line. It's a drawing of a boundary line between two pieces of property, and that was Lincoln's award. Now, here's another of my favorite cases. In Webster versus Angel, Lincoln's client had what Lincoln considered a less than stellar case involving the purchase and sale of land. Now, Lincoln, the night before it was supposed to go to trial, he had everyone there. In fact, the judge was just next door, Judge David Davis. He said, let's have what today we would probably call a mini trial. So the judge sat on the edge of the bed and persuaded the parties to come in, and they gave a quick summation of the case. And it turned out that Lincoln's client did end up winning in this very irregular proceeding. But the other party was unprepared to pay it off. Well, Lincoln wanted to get it resolved, so what did he do? He loaned the money to the defendant to pay his client. Later on, he did get back the $16, by the way. Then there's this one, Gill and Rupert versus Webster. Now, sometimes Lincoln found himself playing the role of informal mediator. Here was a case where they'd been negotiating at some length. They got everything but one issue resolved. Lincoln and opposing counsel said, you know, we can take care of this. Let's just write into the document that the lawyers will reach an agreement on the final issue. And the parties were okay with that. They trusted their lawyers. And the final written settlement agreement incorporated the terms reflecting the lawyers' mutual resolution. In You know, I have to say that I think as Lincoln was so emphatic about trying to find straightforward, pragmatic, and often collaborative solutions that he became somewhat frustrated as we see practice begin to become more developed. He's more likely to be dealing with people at long distances. There's not the personal connection that there was before. But I do have to tell you that many of the insights that we brought out and many of these tendencies, his whole orientation toward problem solving continued into his presidency. Understand and play to your audience to persuade and motivate. Invoke the power of narrative and, if appropriate, humor. Now, in law, as in politics, Lincoln's sense of his audience was often pitch perfect. Lincoln rightfully prided himself on his ability to communicate with a jury. He would tell Herndon, if I can free this case from technicalities and get it properly swung to a jury, I'll win it. Lincoln's use of humor is legendary. He used it effectively to underline key points and disarm opponents. He often made himself the butt of his jokes. He spoke at a banquet held by anti-slavery editors in 1856, and he told the story of an extremely unpleasant-looking man, shall we say, who was riding along a narrow road and was met by a woman. And as she passed, the woman looked at him intently and finally said, well, if you aren't the ugliest man I ever saw. Perhaps so, Lincoln says, the unfortunate fellow said, somewhat crestfallen. But I can't help that, madam. The woman responded, no, I suppose not, but you might just stay at home. And I'm sure Lincoln was alluding to what he thought of his own looks in the course of that. Now, during the war, I'm going to make a couple of allusions to the Civil War here. Many of you know that Lincoln showed a great deal of mastery in attempting to negotiate the rocks and the pitfalls of this awful time in American history, a crucible of American conflict. And one of his earliest challenges, really the first major challenge, was what to do about Fort Sumter. Lincoln knew that Fort Sumter being surrounded was the focal point of developments leading toward the war. And he realized at the time that war was becoming inevitable that he needed both northern and international support. He knew that forces in Charleston would fire on supply ships and thus bear responsibility for starting the war. So Lincoln's decision to send in supply ships without arms, without reinforcements, forced the South to act as aggressors at Fort Sumter by openly informing the South that he would be sending food but not men or munitions. Then there's this decision, the Emancipation Proclamation. Talk about a gutsy move. This executive order freed, well, ultimately, 4 million people. At the time, it wasn't quite clear what it was going to do. It was criticized. Lincoln was vilified. It created, quite honestly, a great deal of dissension within the North and changed the dynamics of the South in many ways. But Lincoln did understand the bigger game. He knew that once the North truly committed itself to emancipation, among other things, the masses in Europe who regarded slavery as an evil demanding eradication would not be easily maneuvered into supporting the South. And indeed, it did go a tremendous way toward isolating the South. Now, this is perhaps my favorite of the lessons from Lincoln. Do not place your own financial or personal interests above the interests of the client. Keep your ego and temper in check. One of Lincoln's most extraordinary qualities was his ability to temper his own financial and emotional needs in the interests of fairness or effective service to his client. Although Lincoln believed in charging fair fees and would often ask for a retainer before rendering services, he professed that an exorbitant fee should never be claimed. Now, his own rates tended to be sufficiently low that he was once brought before a kangaroo court, one of those evenings out on the road. Here's Judge David Davis. David Davis presided over a kangaroo court in which Lincoln was fined for taking such small fees. By the way, David Davis later became the manager of the campaign when Lincoln ran for president, and he ended up on the U.S. Supreme Court. On occasion, Lincoln would offer to relinquish all or part of his fee in order to bring about a settlement. Now, this is not to say Lincoln took the matter of fees less than seriously. In fact, there's a famous case involving the Illinois Central Railroad, where after one significant piece of litigation, one of the biggest tax cases in Illinois history, Lincoln didn't get paid by his client, the Illinois Central Railroad, who said his fee was exorbitant, but he ultimately won and received several $1,000s in fees. One of Lincoln's greatest attributes was self-control. In 1863, as president, he wrote to admonish a young Union officer who was disputatious and abusive of his peers. He said, "Quarrel not at all. No man resolved to make the most of himself can spare time for personal contention." Think about that in our present political pass. Still less can he afford to take all the consequences, including the vitiation of his temper and loss of self-control. Yield larger things to which you can show no more than equal right, and yield lesser ones, though clearly your own. Better give your path to a dog than be bitten by him in contesting for the right. Even killing the dog would not cure the bite. His passions were tightly reined. You know, although it's beyond the scope of what we can talk about today, as I've begun looking into Lincoln's life for my book, there's an extraordinary watershed moment when Lincoln made a fateful decision. He had actually, one story goes, not shown up for his wedding to Mary Todd the first time. He actually spent a number of months in the blackest of moods. In fact, at a time, his friends and colleagues were on a suicide watch for Lincoln. But Lincoln dug himself out from his depression and also ultimately resolved his decision to move forward with not only a friendship, but marriage to Mary Todd. Today we might ask ourselves about that determination and its wiseness for both Mary and Lincoln. But in the circumstances of that time, in that culture, there was almost no choice if either of them wanted to move forward. And so Lincoln made what one might call a response to honor's voice and moved forward in a way that I think allowed his mainspring to remain unsprung and actually acquired a great deal of moral authority over himself and his decision-making. Lincoln's extraordinary self-discipline is reflected in his efforts to control his often extended bouts of depression. A recent book, Lincoln's Melancholy, talks about the fact that this is something he lived with almost his entire life, even the last day of his life. And yet, the fact that he was able to function so effectively speaks volumes about his ability to deal with that. Then there's McCormick versus Manny. This is perhaps my favorite Lincoln story. This was as big a case as had come along in a long time. McCormick is the inventor of the McCormick Reaper. And we're talking about a contest over patents for the Reaper. Cyrus McCormick sued John Manny for infringing on one of those patents, and Lincoln was retained by Manny in the defense. Now, Lincoln engaged in extraordinary research, as was his penchant, as we said. He was a little puzzled why he wasn't hearing more from the client, but he did the very best he could to prepare notes on the law and what he knew about the facts. The venue was originally supposed to be in Chicago, and this is one major reason why Lincoln, the Illinois litigator, was chosen. But venue changed to Cincinnati. Some other lawyers were brought in. They were, quite honestly, very high-powered Eastern attorneys. Now, when he arrived in Cincinnati, he was confronted by the other lawyers. Highly prominent, experienced in business litigation. They'd also been retained by Manny. It quickly became clear that they had their own ideas about how to conduct the case, and they regarded their Illinois colleague as an interloping ignoramus. The lawyers made a point of excluding Lincoln at every pass. He was not invited into their deliberations. He was not even invited to sit at the dinner table with them. Just imagine Lincoln sitting over across the room as they conferred in the hotel in the evenings. Later, when Lincoln tendered a carefully prepared memorandum summarizing his arguments for the defense, it was returned to him unopened. Now, Lincoln actually stayed and watched the trial, came back to Illinois, did not say very much about it. But imagine how you would feel. Lincoln was, if nothing else, a celebrated attorney in his region, but he had been rejected and really relegated to the role of spectator in a case he should have been involved in. Now we move to some years later. It's in the dark days of 1861. Lincoln lost his Secretary of War. He realized that he and the country needed a highly intelligent, forthright, and well-organized individual to help supervise the Union's war effort. Not just anyone, but somebody special. Now, despite all, Lincoln turned to none other than one of those lawyers who treated him with such callous disrespect in the McCormick litigation. And Edwin M. Stanton became Lincoln's Secretary of War for the remainder of the Civil War. Now, Lincoln was probably the most maligned and hated president in U.S. history. But he didn't afford himself the luxury of retaliating in kind. As historian William Miller said, he did not bear down the names of those who had not supported him, or nurse grudges, or hold resentments, or retaliate against enemies. Indeed, he tried not to have enemies, not to plant thorns. And in fact, after the 1864 election, Lincoln said, "So long as I've been here as president, I've not willingly planted a thorn in any man's bosom." Finally, be graceful under pressure and magnanimous in history as in defeat. Ernest Hemingway defined courage as grace under pressure. Grace under pressure, moral courage, may have been Lincoln's greatest attribute, of immense value in leaders in legal as well as political arenas. You know, for most of the war, if you're a student of the Civil War, you know that the possibility of strategic defeat continued to stare Lincoln and the Union in the face. The Northern public received constant, continuing bad news from the field as a succession of generals failed to bring to bay Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. But as heartsick as Lincoln was, he never surrendered to the gloom of defeat. Also, following this, Lincoln wrote a letter to Mary's cousin, who was a cadet at West Point, encouraging him to keep his spirits up. Even when he and his family received an incalculable blow with the death of his son Willie in early 1862, Lincoln picked himself up and went forward, carrying the helm of the Union, a standard he would bear for 3 long years. And Lincoln also forbore from blaming others for setbacks, took the responsibility on his own shoulders. President Lincoln, it said, never shunned any responsibility and often declared that he and not his cabinet was in fault for errors imputed to them, when people sometimes thought otherwise. Finally, and most importantly, Lincoln was magnanimous in victory. He bore the mantle of the Union and its restoration as his central charge. And I have to say, I want to pause and say that I think for Lincoln, ultimately, Lincoln, this supremely rational man who had rejected the very emotional kind of religion of the frontier that he grew up on, began to need to perceive the Civil War, the war in which he was playing a leading role, with its 600,000 deaths, an incalculable toll on the country, in spiritual terms, almost as if he was a priest, charged with the responsibility of sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives on the altar of freedom. And ultimately, this was tied in with his belief that the country's joint and several original sin of slavery could only be expiated by the blood of these people. It was the only way he could justify what was happening in his mind. And he bore it as a tremendous, almost overbearing personal responsibility. His public pronouncements in the wake of major victories were always tempered by the awareness that today's foes were tomorrow's reunited brothers. His most memorable words, those in one of his final and probably his most important speech, the second inaugural, were not aimed at stoking passions, but indeed as a soothing balm for a riven and wounded society, North and South. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Well, as we've seen, the society in which Abraham Lincoln practiced law, pervaded by a strong sense of community, reinforced and encouraged many of the traits and habits that we have seen reflected in Lincoln's own law practice. Even then, Lincoln was an outlier. Lincoln carried over many of the lessons of practice into his presidency. And although lawyers perform in many different settings, some of the central insights of Lincoln's practice, as well as his period in the presidency, remain of great value to us today, not only as lawyers, but as those who engage in the civil discourse of our country. I think we would all be better off if we put our minds more on Lincoln. Thanks very much.